participates in change-making activity around the world, and it's documented again and again by Andrew and his fine team. His next book, Resilience: Why Things Bounce Back, will be published by Random House. Please welcome our man of the future, Andrew Zolli. Take care.
Thank you. Hi. How you doing? Thanks, John, for a horrifyingly overpromising introduction. It's great to be with you here at the end of what has been really extraordinary, or close to the end, of what's been a really extraordinary day. Because no man should be forced to see his own derriere on a giant screen like that. Please put my slides up. Thanks. You have no idea the pain and agony I just saved your eyeballs. So how y'all feeling? It's like 3 o'clock. What time is it right now? It's 2:30. It's the peak learning hour of the day, people. Okay? You're on the asymptotic minima between the time you last ate and you will next drink and pee. Okay? This is the time slot that I get. I'm excited. Thank you very much. Now, because most of you don't know anything about me, I just want to say a couple words of introduction and then talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. So just really quickly, I'm a futures researcher. I specifically focus in 3 areas, in foresight, in social innovation, and as I'll talk about in a moment, in greater detail, in resilience. I run an organization called PopTech that brings together scientists and technologists and engineers and designers, healthcare workers, people in the corporate, social, and ecological sector, community activists, to collaborate on breakthrough new approaches to some of the world's most significant challenges. And there's hundreds of hours of amazing free thought leadership content, like the kinds of stuff we've been talking about here, really amazing and inspiring stuff. That's all available there for free. In addition to that, I'm one of the explorers at the National Geographic Society. I'm part of their Big and Tall program, where they fit fat men into submarines and send them to the bottom of the ocean. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Chubby Cousteau. And as John mentioned, I've just finished a 3.5-year project with a whole research team looking at the systemic, structural, cultural, community-led dynamics of resilience and how systems, communities, ecologies, bounce back and absorb disruptive change, and what they have to learn from each other, what that pattern language has to suggest to one another. Now, today, what I want to do is talk to you about 3 big things. There's a little bit about PopTech, but before I do, I have to start with a little bit of a note of humility. You know, I usually come closer to the end of the gathering. I'm actually not going to talk about healthcare in the traditional industrial structural sense, although I will be talking about healthcare throughout. You'll see the theme that emerges. But as we talk about the future, I think, given that we're all living in what has been a recently reorganized economic reality, in which the professional prognosticating classes, those people in shiny shirts that show up to say, this is what's going to happen, so badly missed the call, so badly dropped the ball, I think you should all have a reasonably high level of suspicion about anybody who wants to talk about the future. And so I thought I'd begin my remarks today by talking a little bit about why it's so hard for all of us, the professional foresight researchers and senior leaders and innovators, all of us, to think about what comes next. And the easiest way I can start that conversation is by showing you these 2 pictures. These are 2 images of what people at the beginning of the 20th century thought life was going to look like here at the beginning of the 21st century. They thought we were going to be living in giant electrical transformers, and that we were going to be rolling our whole town over to Grandma's house in one of the most schizophrenic relationships with the natural world you could possibly imagine. Though, I don't know if you can see it up on the right. They did get the tagline right, trade your trouble for a bubble, right? So why do we get it so wrong? We get it wrong all the time. It's nice to look back and go, ah, ha, 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 right? But the images that we're producing of the future will be looked at by the future, and they'll go, oh, those parochial early 21st century folks, how could they have missed X, Y, and Z? And the reason for that is because the equipment that we bring to the entire exercise of thinking about the future was not really designed for the task. We bring a faulty engine of forecasting. And in fact, this reflects one really important cognitive bias that all of us have built into our cognition about thinking about the future. And that's called the novelty bias. When people think about the future, they have a tendency to take the dominant new fact and simply make it the dominant fact. So if today is about sustainability, tomorrow is about eco-utopia or eco-disaster. If today is about recession, tomorrow is about depression. That is to say, we have a tendency to overemphasize the present in some of our long-term visions of the future. And I can give you a really simple example of this. In 1977, there were exactly 4 members of the International Brotherhood of Professional Elvis Impersonators. Now, it takes a certain gonadal circumference, let's say, to call yourself the international anything when you have 4 members and they all live on the same block in Las Vegas. But with a lot of hard work, chaptering efforts, outreach, today, there are more than 35,000 male and female, give it up for the sisters, male and female members of the International Union of Professional Elvis Impersonators. And at this rate, by 2050, 1 in 3 people on Earth is going to be an Elvis impersonator. You have to scratch basically everything you have heard at this conference and double down on peanut butter banana, toasted sandwiches, and giant mutton chop sideburns. Now, much more seriously, I'll give you another example of a cognitive bias, and that is we have the mistaken belief that we think about risks in the right ways. We have a structural bias when thinking about certain categories of risk. And I'll give you a really simple example. Here are 2 risks we read about in the newspaper all the time. Over here, we have the bad guy threat. We read about this all the time. This is the Dead Dudes Club, all right? Very expensive club to join. And over here on the right, we have the disappearance of the largest glacier in Patagonia inside of 75 years. That's a picture from the 1920s. That's the present down in South America. Now, here's the thing I want to show you. There was an in-house consulting organization within the military who did a head-to-head health risk comparison of these 2 risks that you read about every single day. They're in the newspaper, they're on TV, they're on the web, they're ubiquitous in our culture. And here's the really interesting thing. Your chances, my chances, of being affected in your person, the health risk associated with the Bad Guys Club, about 1 in 28 million, and we've spent trillions of dollars to go after it, and I'm not here to argue that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's a thing. That's just the way it is. Your chances of being affected by the health risk on the right, about 1 in 6. And yet, even when we get the world's leaders together in the same room to talk about this, they can't agree to have another meeting. It's that contentious. So here's the thing I want to tell you. I want to challenge you to think about. Why is it so easy for us to galvanize national and international response to threats that look like the threat on the left, but so difficult to galvanize responses to threats that look like the one on the right? After all, we read about them all the same time, right? Well, some of it has to do with the fact that we don't properly understand their impacts on us. Some of it has to do with the fact that those guys on the left actually have a face. Our brains are designed to deal with personified threats. We hear over and over again, what's the #1 killer of Americans every year? What's the #1 killer? Come on, guys. If you guys don't know, we are seriously in trouble. What's the #1 killer of Americans every single year? Heart disease. And yet we do not have an international war on cheeseburgers. Thank God, because I would need to move. I would become Canadian momentarily. And the point is this. Our brains are very good at dealing with fast-moving, personified risks that break a moral taboo, and very, very bad at thinking about slower-moving, accreting risks over longer periods of time. And what are most of the forces that we have to contend with? Most of the issues that you have to contend with are the result of which? distal or proximate, slow-moving or fast-moving. In another way to say it, we have a tendency, as Stuart Brand famously said, we have a tendency in our culture, the fast-moving trends get all the attention, but it's the slow-moving trends that have all the power. So what do we do with this? Well, in the near term, increasingly, as we deal with peak everything, as John Thacker was talking about, and the weird second and third order impacts of that on our society, we're going to be talking about resilience. How do we build into our communities, into our institutions, into ourselves, the ability to contend with disruption that comes from unusual places and leaves strange correlations in its wake? And at the same time, we're also going to continue to talk about much of what we've talked about today, which is about innovation. And in fact, resilience and innovation go together. Right? If innovation is about the creation of new forms of value in anticipation of future demand that creates systemic change, that's an agenda. Resilience is an agenda for innovation and vice versa. But increasingly, that's going to be on our agenda. You know, dealing with the adaptation to disruption as opposed to merely fending it off. Dealing more with a world that's driven by adaptation than mitigation, because many of the forces that have been unlocked are so big that they're going to affect us whether we want them to or not. Now, how do we do that? How do we make that real? Well, there's another cognitive bias that all of us have to deal with. It also involves the way we think about risks. But this one, it begins to tell us a little bit about where we could go and how we could get there to deal with some of these novel risks. Now, in order to do that, I want to tell you a story. At the turn of the 20th century, end of the 19th, there was a movement in Britain with the rise of the automobile for proper English gentlemen to cut down their hedges, because the roads that had been designed weren't really designed for automobiles. There wasn't traffic lights and street signs, and cars were running off the road. And so these fine Victorian men had their hedges grown very high around their mansions. There was a movement to get people to cut down their hedges. And at about that time, there was a letter that appeared in the Times of London that said this: before any of you are induced to cut down your hedges to facilitate the flow of automobiles, I think you might like to know what happened to me. You have to pretend I'm reading this as Lord Krusty Bottom III, okay? So just, I'm the Earl of Hassenpfaff. Okay. 4 years ago, I cut down my hedges to facilitate the flow of automobile traffic in my community. What do you think happened? What happened is two things. My front yard is smothered in dust, and the accident rate has been considerably increased. Why? Because drivers took the benefits of increased safety in the system to adapt their behavior to drive faster. Right? You may have seen something very similar to this on America's highways. In fact, this is not just something that affects folks who drive SUVs. Just to give you an example, in Europe, there were 3 studies done of the effect of adding anti-lock brakes to taxi cabs. And what they discovered is that when anti-lock brakes were added, taxi drivers drove faster, closer to other cars, and broke later. And it was particularly bad for people who wore bicycle helmets. One of the extraordinary things about bicycle helmet laws is that they've had far less impact on the health and safety of bicyclists, primarily because drivers who are driving on roads where bicyclists wear helmets think that bicyclists are safer than they are, and they drive faster around them. This is something called risk homeostasis. It's the basic, the important correlate here is that human beings, all of us in this room, you and me, we all have an innate level of risk. And if we adapt systems to make them safer, often people's behavior will migrate so that they maintain that level of risk. This led to a famous rule in skydiving called Booth's Rule number 2, which says the safer skydiving gear becomes, the more chances skydivers will take in order to keep the fatality rate constant. Because that's the job of skydivers. So what do we do about this, especially because when risk homeostasis is summed to the level of organizational culture, when it's summed to the general level of culture, we know what it looks like. This is not an necessary ecological disaster that is the consequence of the inordinate feedback loop of carbon loading in our atmosphere. This is people in a community, specifically a company, BP, that had safety laws that said, my goodness, make sure you wear rubber boots when you climb up the ramps on our rigs, but when you get to the top, it's okay not to pour cement down the wellheads to cover up the wells. This is risk homeostasis in action. So what do we do about it? Well, one of the most important things, and this is that theme that you heard John mentioned over and over again, is that resilience resides in community. It resides not as an intervention in community, but as a byproduct of the authentic expression of communities, unlocked and enabled, not intervened with. And one of my favorite examples of this in the world is this extraordinary organization called Ceasefire. It's based in Chicago. And it was started by this guy down in the lower left-hand corner named Gary Slutkin, who was an epidemiologist with World Health. Gary worked at the very tip of the spear in the early 1980s on HIV before it had a name, when it was called GRID, before that, when AIDS didn't have a name. All the way through going to sub-Saharan Africa to build some of the very first truly successful large-scale public efforts at contending with HIV and its intersection with other illnesses. And he came back to Chicago, and he noticed something really amazing, and that is that the outbreaks of gun violence on the south side of Chicago, and to give you a sense of how severe the epidemic of violence is on the south side of Chicago, in 2007, your chances of being affected by gun violence on the south side of Chicago were higher than those in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is people getting killed in American cities. And he noticed that the outbreaks of violence, the sort of primary outbreaks and then secondary infections, if you will, of gun violence, looked very much like the epidemiological patterns of the illnesses he was working on. And so he built this extraordinary organization, the premise of which is to treat violence as if it were a human communicable illness. And increasingly, in the health system, we're going to see this. The behavioral intervention models that public health and healthcare have developed have enormous application well beyond their borders and well beyond the narrow definitions of specific disease vectors that we think about. And here's what they do. Copying very much what they might otherwise do in a public health intervention, they do three things. They identify the highest risk transmissors, who are often recently released from prison. And they work to interrupt their behavior. They map them and interrupt them at the local level. And what they do is they train formerly incarcerated senior drug and gang representatives to become violence interrupters, essentially community health workers who do real-time violence mediation, often when the guns are drawn. The second thing they do is to work to change the mindsets and behaviors of those people who are at the highest risk of transmission. And the third thing they do is work to change the broad behavioral norms of the community. And according to an independent randomized controlled trial by the Department of Justice, it lowers the violent crime rate by up to 75% in the first year. That's part of the healthcare system. That's the opportunity space that exists in the 95% that isn't formalized around the institutions that we run. That's the great opportunity, I think, to deal with this balance of distal and proximate that you heard, or proxal, that you heard about a little bit earlier. Now, I don't have time to tell you about this, but I do want to leave you with one really cool idea. Is that okay? No one's suffering PowerPoint fatigue? Everyone all right? It's 2:45, I think, right now. Okay, so how do we begin to apply those ideas here to other areas of behavioral change? One of the places we have enormous opportunity to learn from is from games. And you heard a little bit about this on the breakout session. I don't mean learning to make games that drive behavioral change. I mean learning from the dynamics of games. Amazingly, lots of people play them, and mostly not sweaty, smelly teenagers in your basement. They're mostly folks who are a little bit older. The average player, a male, is 31. The average female player is 43. Now, I want to give you an example of a game that you might know. How many people here have played this game? Okay, how many people have desperately played this game trying to pretend that they weren't where they were in the Miami airport at 3 in the morning? Oh, that's just me? Right, this is a game. How many people have never played this game? Yeah, okay. those are the people we should be studying, okay? Those are your outliers right there. Now here's the amazing thing. How many hours do you think people play this game? Just out of curiosity, shout it out. Thousands. Thousands, you're absolutely right. You're slightly off. This is 10-year-old data, so it's probably gone up since then. And I want to say all of this comes from Louis van Ahn, who is a superb computer scientist at Carnegie Mellon. Now, Louis looked at this, and the thing to notice about these games is that this game technically sucks. This is the most boring-ass piece of crap waste of time that you can do. And yet we spend bazillions of hours. Just to put this in perspective, okay? If you normalize that across the course of a year, right? Let's take the Empire State Building. It took about 7 million human hours to build the Empire State Building, but in solitary years, that's about 6.5 hours. Okay? And the thing about games is they are great at motivating us to do crap we do not want to do over and over and over and over again. We've been having this conversation. How on earth are we going to motivate people to take responsibility for a whole bunch of behaviors? And here it is. We've been literally doing it in the airport. So what can we learn from these things? Well, I don't have time to tell you about this, but I want to tell you about this one. Right? We think about these games. What's true about them? Well, they have atomizable small actions. They have interfaces that tell us how to use them. They have very tight feedback loops between doing something and getting a result. They have challenges that are organized like staircases. They're hard, they become easy, and then they jump up a level and they become hard again. When we jump up one of those levels, we increase our access to the world of the game. And when we do, we get conspicuous status. Hey, I'm a 47th level mage, man. Don't back off. You know, check the robes. Does this sound like anything you know? Because these behaviors are exactly how you get one of those in the real world. Exactly the same. In fact, they're exactly how you get these things. Lots and lots of systems have figured out how to make people do crappy actions over and over again for their ultimate benefit by putting them in reward structures that look like this. And it started with these people. 12-year-old girls, okay? Every one of you has bought some Thin Mints making a bad healthcare decision because of these badges. And we talk about social media, blah, blah, blah. Look, we've invented social badges, blah. It goes right back to those people, okay? There's nothing new under this sun. In fact, my favorite example of this is the Prius. I have a friend who bought a Prius, and he just takes his foot off the gas every time he's going downhill. Why? Because he's trying to maximize the efficiency of the engine, because there's a little blue line there that tells him it's a good thing to do. I said, what benefit are you getting of this? He said, I don't care. I just want to keep that line right there. And you can see it on LinkedIn. Okay? The economic value of the last 10% of the information that LinkedIn uses for each and every one of you to better target advertisements at you is enormously economically valuable, hugely valuable to them. But do they say, hey, Andrew, would you please fill out just a few more aspects of your profile so that we can use it to better sell you Viagra and home mortgage refi? No. What they say is, you're almost there. I can taste it. I believe in you, brother. And this is my favorite iPhone application. It shows what this looks like as we begin to apply these things to scale. And it was designed by an amazing design firm, Frog Design. I hope you all know about them. Great company. It's called Tempted, and this is how it works. Let's say you're a 40-ish, slightly heavy-set guy, an Italian in New York City, and let's say you happen to find yourself in the Krispy Kreme donut store, let's say. Okay, just hypothetically. And as you're in there, you're thinking, my God, I should not be eating this donut. Diabetes waiting for me. It's the diabetes special. What this app allows you to do is take a picture of that donut, instantaneously send it to your friends, and allow them to say, for the love of God, Andrew, don't eat the donut. And if you don't eat the donut, they get points. Yeah, that's amazing. We have yet to scratch the surface of how to use these tools to drive behaviors so that we don't have to do these kinds of interventions in our hospitals, in our clinical centers. We don't have to do the kinds of intensive behavioral change at the proximal point. There's so much to be done in the distal space. My favorite example of this from the energy world is that a fantastic company called O-Power that delivers custom energy reports. And they drive huge behavioral change in how people use energy by encouraging them to earn a smiley. A smiley! That's it. No cash rewards, no big behavioral change, just if you're really good, you get 2. Because all of us were once 5 years old and we remember what it was like to get a gold star. Ultimately, this kind of behavior, we have to stop thinking in terms of embracing the noble benefits. Because ultimately, I hate Bob. And my hatred of Bob and my desire to conspicuously display my innate superiority to him will ultimately drive me back to health if you guys will help. Thanks.
There is, I believe, a fairly large contingent of frog designers here. If you guys want to raise your hands, that's a great app. I do know frog is pretty well represented here.